Well, I am very excited to welcome this next guest. She survived living in Europe during the Holocaust and has gone on to live a life filled with triumph and accomplishment. And she's also the author of a new book called The Force of Nature, the remarkable true story of one Holocaust survivor's resilience, tenacity, and purpose. Her name is Gisele Huff, a true force of nature and also the president and founder of the Gerald Huff Foundation for Humanity. Gisele, thank you so much for joining me today.
And thank you for having me.
So, Gisele, you have lived through arguably one of the darkest moments in history, the Holocaust. You've lost family members, you've had to sew the Star of David onto your clothes, and you've had to go into hiding during that dark time. And yet you have done some amazing work. Could you share some of those highlights with us?
Certainly. I was born in France in 1936, 4 years before the Germans invaded. My family was Russian or Ukrainian in origin. My maternal grandparents had escaped from Russia and were actually illegal immigrants to France because my grandfather didn't want to serve in the Tsar's army in the First World War. And my paternal grandparents uh, were from Odessa, where my grandfather was a factory manager. They escaped when the Bolshevik Revolution came about. So my father was already 17 when the family came to Paris, but my mother was born in Paris. And they met, they got married, they had me in 1936, and then 4 years later, France was conquered in 6 weeks.
Wow.
My mother and my father was mobilized, so he was in the army. But my mother and I had escaped from Paris as the Germans were coming, closer to the city in the Exodus, which was these hundreds of thousands of people who got into whatever transportation means they had to run away from Paris while the Germans were coming. And while that was going on, which was reminiscent of what happened in Ukraine recently, um, the German planes were shooting people on the roads as they were making their way out of Paris. So my mother and I came back. My father was demobilized. Life went on as the Germans occupied the city and this country and the country. And in 1941, they started the genocide of Jews. So they started by taking men who were of working age, and they had a propaganda machine that made it look like, I mean, they were in France, so it was not their own country. They had to rationalize their actions and propagandize them. And they came up with the story that these were men who were being taken to work in work camps in Germany, labor camps in Germany. So my uncle, my mother's brother, and my father were taken in 1941 and were deported in 1942 and were killed in Auschwitz in July of that year. Uh, by that time, the Germans started deporting people who were not French born, Jews who were not French born and living in Paris at the time. And that included all the rest of my family, including my four cousins who were, children, and leaving behind only my grandmother, my aunt, and my cousin who were in hiding. After that, my mother, who was still working and living in our apartment, because she was French born, as was I, and so we weren't in the category yet. And my mother, who was a very diffident, very protected young woman who had by that point lost every support system she ever had, decided that we couldn't stay in Paris and we had to go into hiding. And she saved our lives. So she got false papers. We went down to a little town close to Toulouse in the southwest of France. And we made believe we were Catholic. She had a false identity card. And I had to go to a church for catechism because I was at that age. And I complained bitterly because I hated kneeling. And she said, in no uncertain terms, you have to do it. And so we survived until 1945 when the Americans and the Allies liberated France, which is why my book starts with this sentence: I love America. Without American forces liberating us, I wouldn't be here to tell you the story. Wow. So we came back to Paris. There was one member of of my father's family who had come to America back in 1922 when the family had moved to Paris, and he started looking for any survivors to the Holocaust. After the war was over, found my aunt, his mother, my grandmother, and his nephew, my cousin, and sponsored them to come to America. And so they got here in 1946. And then my aunt organized the rest of the remote family to put up the money to sponsor my mother and me to come to America. So we arrived in 1947 when I was 11 years old. We had $400 to our name and 2 suitcases. And we moved in with my other 3 members of the family. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in the South Bronx, which was a ghetto at that time. And I was one of 3 white kids in my class in the 6th grade at a school that was called PS2, the City Zoo, because it had been a hospital during the Civil War, and it was a dilapidated building that was ignored by the school system, as many kids at that time were who were Black. So here in 1947, in the most progressive city in America, my experience at the age of 11 was to be thrown into these circumstances. And I never forgot that those kids were being warehoused, not educated at that time. And this totally inspired me later on in my life to, work very hard to change that.
Yeah, and you also use the word hope a lot in your book. In fact, in the prologue, you say, "As long as there's life, there's hope," and then you go on to say, "When hope is matched with purpose, the results are tremendous." And I look at the story that you wrote, and I just think, how did you keep hope during all of that darkness?
There's a saying in French, and I think it's in English as well: as long as there's life, there's hope. And because saving our lives was such an impulse, I mean, it was the driving force of the time my mother and I survived, it became a thing unto itself. Life itself was worth everything. And if you think that, then you can only be a person who looks forward. And that's what hope means. If you look forward, if you wake up every day and you try to move your whatever your passion is ahead, then you automatically have hope. Despair is something that comes when you've given up. And if you love life as I do, in all ways, I mean, I love life. I love to eat. I love to dance. I love life. Then there was only one way for me to be, and that's to be hopeful that every further day would be better than the one I was living. And many things happened in my life that made that not true. Losing my late husband and my late son, both at the age of 54, both to pancreatic cancer, 31 years apart, was not hopeful, but it drove me to things that, were the achievements of my life.
Wow. And you describe how you came to America in the book. You talk about how the ship passed by the Statue of Liberty. You recall Lady Liberty's motto of, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free." I have to wonder, what did that experience mean to you at that age?
It's indescribable. Uh, I mean, I can, there's very little that one remembers specifically about things that happen. But being on the deck of that ship at dawn, it was early in the morning, and going by this symbol of freedom, of hope, was, I don't have words to describe it.
Oh,
It's really something, and it does, it gives you a glimpse of you, I mean the audience, all people who were born in America. It gives you a glimpse of an understanding of what it means to be an immigrant and to appreciate the country you've chosen and that has welcomed you in a way that people who are born here take for granted.
yeah. Well, Gisele, thank you so much. We're going to take just a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Gisele's feelings on education and the American dream. We'll be right back. Well, welcome back. We are continuing our conversation with Gisele Huff, a Holocaust survivor who has gone on to live a life of purpose and is now releasing a new book. Once again, Gisele, thank you so much for joining us. I want to talk about your love for education. You've talked about the importance in your book about education, working decades to improve the lives of students in public schools. And our students here in the Quad Cities just went back to class, so I guess I would be curious to know what your message to them would be.
Well, education is everything. So, children should pay as much attention as they possibly can to what they're learning. But they're not in a system that is designed for the 21st century. Let me begin by saying that my love for education is because it was the path that allowed me to achieve what I did in life. I mean, going from, arriving in this country with $400 at the age of 11, getting a PhD in political philosophy at Columbia University, running for Congress, getting a job in a foundation where I spent 22 years trying to transform the education system. All of that was made possible because I had an education. Without that, it would not have happened. So, and it is the fundamental necessity for an operating democracy where people are self-governing. They have to make the right choices in terms of leadership in order to ensure that society will continue. So education is the fundamental right, and what drives me crazy is how little attention is paid to it. When you think back at uh, primaries, the Democratic primaries in 2020, when we had so many debates with so many people on stage, you could count on the fingers of two hands how many times education was mentioned or discussed. I'm talking about K-12 education. So it's the most important thing in the world, both in terms of the economy, society, who you are as a person, the way your path in life. It is absolutely essential. And yet it gets very short shrift. So
Right.
what I mean by that is, so I started out, as I mentioned, in a very bad situation, in a very bad school that was really especially destructive for the Black kids who were the largest population in that school. And what I learned when I was working in the foundation and I was trying to to try to do something about education was that it was the system that was not working. The
Right.
people within the system were working their hearts out. Teachers have a very tough job, and it's very difficult to be a teacher. I taught classes here and there. It's a very hard job, very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So all the people, I mean, there are always bad apples, but there's only a few bad apples in the education system because nobody goes into it to become rich. Everybody knows that teachers are underpaid and they're not respected. So I mean, it's one thing to be poorly paid, but if people really respect you or admire you, then that somehow helps you. Not with teachers in this country. In other countries, yes, but not in this country. So why is it then that the education system is always underperformed? The kids go in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed at the age of 5, and by the third grade or the fourth grade, they're like all of the joy is taken out of learning, and by the eighth grade, they're So here is a statistic: eighth grade math and eighth grade reading or English.
Mm-hmm.
In both those subjects, only 34% of American children are proficient.
Wow.
That means 66% are not.
Wow.
You know, I mean, people should be on the streets screaming.
Right. You think that people would be, absolutely. And you talk about your experience. You talk about, coming here with $400 in your suitcase and then going on to get your PhD and really living the American dream. And
Right.
in a recent interview, you had said that the American dream is dead. And I guess I would just be curious to know why you think that is and how do we get that back? Because I think so many people want that still.
I think it is because we are not preparing our children for the 21st century. The education system is designed for the 20th century. It was designed to produce 15% thinkers and 85% workers. But the workers had to be smart enough and educated enough to be able to do all of the manufacturing jobs and all the jobs that were created in our very prosperous after-war period.
Okay. Well,
And so that was good enough, that was it. That was the requirements of the 20th century. This
yeah.
is not what the 21st century is about.
Right. Well, then how do we fix that?
So we have to stop. That's what I was trying to do when I was working at the foundation. The kind of grants we made was to transform education from a teaching emphasis to a learning emphasis. In other words, it doesn't matter if teachers teach their heart out and they reach 2 or 3 or 5 kids out of the 25 kids each time they have a class. It doesn't matter if 20 kids aren't learning. The point of education is to learn. Mm-hmm. And in this world we live in, what the purpose of education up until the 21st century was the transfer of knowledge. How do you make a wheel? How do you start fire? How do you build an airplane? The transfer of knowledge.
Right.
But knowledge is now contained in that little thing that's no bigger than a cigarette box that contains, if you know how to get it, the knowledge of the entire world that's updated every second. More knowledge in that little box than all of the teachers all over the world put together.
Wow.
So the transfer of knowledge in a classroom shoving information in kids' heads is not what the 21st century is about. The 21st century is about knowing what information is, knowing where to find it, knowing how to evaluate its veracity, and its the need for it, for whatever problem you need to solve, applying the information and solving the problem. That's how the human species is going to survive the 21st century.
Wow.
But is that what our schools are teaching us? No. Our teachers are they're still teaching us the Battle of Hastings was in 1066. And if you take the test and you don't get that right with the little bubble, then you fail.
Wow. I think, finally this morning, I think we are curious to know, why write this book now? Why not maybe 10 years ago or in the future? Why now?
Well, I'm 86 years old, so the future is like, limited. And it was a natural development. I retired in 2020, so I had time, even though I started the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity, named after my late son, where I am promoting universal basic income as a transitional solution to the fact that the robots are coming and that jobs are going to disappear. And then how do you hold people responsible if there's no jobs for them? So all of this was churning in my head, and I decided I'm going to write it down. And I ran it by a couple of people, and they were kind of interested in knowing more. So I finished writing the book, and it's probably the only book I'll ever write.
Hey, well, that's okay. There's so much information in this book, and it's definitely something, the title and the subtitle definitely, do it justice. You are a force of nature with the remarkable story of resilience, tenacity, and purpose. Gisele Huff, thank you so much for joining us today. I definitely think we all have a lot to learn from you, and I think a great place for us to start is by reading your book.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
I enjoyed this.
Absolutely. And we will have more information on Gisele's book, Force of Nature, on our website, wqad.com.